One of the really main themes of this essay about grief is has to do with the general topic of whether emotions or the feeling of an emotion can be irrational. And one of the things that he wants to establish in the beginning of the essay is that our emotions are connected up with, that they're not mere feelings, they're connected up with other things, especially with our beliefs. And that sometimes, and this isn't specific to grief, feeling an emotion can be irrational in the sense that it's irrational to feel a particular emotion in a particular context. He, I think he gives an example of somebody who has somebody who has a pathological hatred of cats and feels that all cats must die. That would simply be an irrational, the feeling of anger against cats or something. But let's take an example of something like fear. If I'm being chased by a gigantic dog and I'm afraid, that's not irrational. That is the feeling of that fear, or that fact that I feel that fear at a particular time is not irrational because the dog could hurt me. But if I have a fear of mailboxes, that is, if every time I pass a mailbox I am paralyzed with fear, that would be an unfortunate condition, and no laughing matter. But it would also be irrational because, let's say, the belief that the mailbox could hurt me is unfounded. That is, he talks about warranted emotions and unwarranted emotions. It would be warranted to feel fear if a dog is chasing me. It would be unwarranted to feel fear if I was passing a mailbox, or feel fear because I was walking past a mailbox. So one of the things he wants to that's one of the things he wants to establish about emotions, that they're related to other things, to beliefs. And of course, if we look at his definition G, they're related to what he calls the certain conative features, which just basically means wanting. But it's the connection with these so-called conative or wanting features that makes grief irrational in a particular way. And here we really have to focus on a distinction that he makes between a desire and a wish. Now, here I am on page 465, bottom of 465, where he says grief can be less than fully rational along three dimensions. And as he says on page 466, the first dimension is the cognitive or belief aspect. And that's when we have a mistaken belief. Right. When he says fears can be irrational in this way, if based on an unwarranted or unreasonable belief. He says the second dimension, emotions can be irrational in their feeling or affective aspects or dimensions. For instance, it can be irrational. Let me make this bigger. I'm right here. For instance, it can be irrational to grieve to the degree one does, with the depth, the extent, or with the longevity of the feelings constitutive of grief. And there, I believe he's talking about, let's say that a famous person dies that I have no real connection with, and that I don't really feel that important. Is that important to me personally? If I were to grieve in the full way over someone who died recently, Stanley, the comic book guy, died, and he was kind of an important person to me when I was a kid, but I can't say that I have that strong connection with him. Or Bernardo Bertolucci, the filmmaker, recently died. I think it's arguable that if I were to grieve deeply over those two figures, neither of whom I met, or neither of whom constitute an ongoing important presence in my life, that would be irrational. So grief can, like other emotions, be irrational or unwarranted because of something to do with a fault in the belief I have, the cognitive aspect, or the feeling or affective aspect. But the third aspect is different. This is as he says, thirdly, emotions may be less than fully rational in the dimension of their ingredient desires. But this is different. Let's just read through it here. It's a very important part. This is on page 466. Thirdly, emotions may be less than fully rational in the dimension of their ingredient desires. Remember that his definition of grief has these three elements: the belief or cognitive element, the feeling or affective element, and the third is the desiring element. According to theory G, grief is irrational in this respect. That is, grief is not sometimes irrational, like it would be sometimes irrational to feel fear, and sometimes not. It would sometimes be irrational to feel general sadness, and sometimes not. But grief is always irrational. That's the big point. But in what way? For instance, G is satisfied as follows: S grieves N's death. S knows and believes that N is dead. S has feelings of loss, pain, anger, and the like at the loss of N. And importantly, S desires that it not be the case that N is dead. Remember, this is the so-called belief contrary desire. That is the essential part of his definition of grief, is that the desire that you have is contrary to the belief that you have. The desire that a certain person not be dead, or that the person be alive, or the person hadn't died, is contrary to your belief that they have died. S knows and believes that N is dead. S has feelings of loss, pain, anger, and the like at the loss of N. And importantly, S desires that it not be the case that N is dead. In suitable circumstances, these conditions are sufficient for S's grief at the death of N. Note that S's belief and S's desire are incompatible. That is, a belief and a desire had by an agent at a given time are incompatible in this way in case the desire is unsatisfiable on the truth of the belief. That's the key thing. That is, given the truth of the belief that a person has died, the desire that they be alive is unsatisfiable. Since in the present instancing of G, S's belief is true, by hypothesis N has died, S's desire is unsatisfiable. In whatever sense of necessary, it is true that the dead cannot also be alive. That is, not dead. In that sense, S's desire is necessarily unsatisfiable. Since S's belief that N is dead is true and reasonably held, S understands this very necessity, again by hypothesis. Thus, S's desire is inherently irrational. That's important, right? That is, again, grief is not. To be grieving, I think would be the most correct way to say it, is to be in an irrational state, because the desire that you have is irrational. Insofar as you know that it is necessarily unsatisfiable. Thus, S's desire is inherently irrational in that it is recognizably unsatisfiable and necessarily so on S's own understanding of it. G then implies that the emotion of grief is, in just this way, inherently less than rational in its desired dimension. So it is the presence of the counter-belief desire that is the key point here, and is really the point of the essay. It's what's new in the essay, saying that, well, it's not, he's not saying that to grieve is irrational. That is, he's not saying that grief is an irrational response to the death of someone close to you. He couldn't be saying that, because that would just, it would be wrong. What he is saying is that When we do grieve, we are in an irrational state because our desire is irrational. And that's interesting to me, an interesting characterization of grief, because it does seem to, as he argues later in the essay, this does seem to be explanatory of what it's like to go through grief, what it feels like to be grieving, to be in that state where what you know to be true and what you want to be true is in definite conflict. The key thing here, I think, though, as he goes on, is the distinction between grieving for someone and feeling sorrow at someone's death. This is where he goes on page 467. In order to defend G, he says here, I must argue for the truth of this implication. This will be done in two ways. First, grief differs from sorrow, but how does it differ from sorrow? That is, I can feel sorrow over the death of Stan Lee or Bernardo Bertolucci. I guess I do, but I don't grieve over them. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is not in the belief aspect of my sorrow or even the feeling aspect. It's in the desire aspect. In fact, what makes it true that I'm not grieving over those men who have died is that I don't desire that they not have died. And that may seem heartless, but it is not that I'm indifferent. It's that the wanting aspect of my response to their death is wish rather than desire. So he says here, the emotions of grief and sorrow are alike in that they are intentional conditions. In fact, they admit the same objects. That is, the belief is the same, and it may be even that the feeling is the same. What's different is the so-called conative or wanting elements. As he says here, therefore, on the assumption, I'm right here. Therefore, on the assumption that grief and sorrow are genuinely different emotions, and in light of the fact that nominal differences, common objects, and possible common causes and consequences are all non-differentiating, it seems that the differences between these emotions can only be traced to differences in their ingredient conative elements. Okay, so that's the key. As he says here, we have then the tentative result that if grief and sorrow are different, their differentia, that is what differentiates them, consists in conative differences. Well, what is that conative difference? He says, unlike grief, sorrow's conative component is not desire or desiring in the full sense required for genuine grief. Rather, it is the counterpoint of desiring, which is sorrow's conative component. The counterpoint of desiring, which lacks a typical belief consistent rationality requirement, is, of course, wishing. So the key here is the supposed difference between a desire on the one hand and a wish on the other. How do we know the difference between those two things? Well, you can put it this way. When Stan Lee died, I felt bad. But I didn't have a desire that he still be alive, or I didn't have a desire that he not have died. I might have had a wish. And what's the difference between a wish and a desire? The difference is, I suppose, that we can wish for anything. And we can wish for all sorts of things and all sorts of things that we know are not true and cannot be true. For instance, I can wish that I could fly like Superman, which I did when I was a kid. But a wish is not as strong as a desire. And The key, I think, is that desires actually prompt me to do something to obtain the objects of my desire, whereas wishes don't. So if I were to say I had, let's say that I know that I can't fly like Superman, but I have a desire to fly like Superman, that will prompt me to do things to be able to fly like Superman, and that's something that I know is not possible. And that would be to put me in an irrational state. But if I merely wish, I would say it would be nice to be able to fly like Superman, even though I know that I can't. Then I'm not in a rational state. So this is what he says here. This he says, in short, a person can wish for anything, possible or impossible, past as well as future events. This is because the logically appropriate objects of wishing is a wider category of situations or event than the appropriate objects of desires. So this is an interesting point, and its relevance to grief is that if I merely wish that someone were still alive when I know that they're dead, I'm not grieving, and one of the signs that I'm not grieving is that I'm not in an irrational state, because I can wish for anything without it being an irrational wish. Maybe there's no irrational wish. Whereas if I desire something that I know I can never get, then the idea is I am in an irrational state.